Thanks for joining us on Beyond the Sermon, the podcast of First Methodist Church in Collingswood, New Jersey. The goal of our podcast is not just to share our sermons, but to go beyond the sermon, to have conversations about what we're learning and what God is doing in us and in our community. This conversation you're about to hear was inspired by our 2023 sermon series, Exalted, Living in Light of the Ascension of Jesus. You can find more information about our church at fumccollingswood.org. Thanks for joining us in this conversation.
Because we're talking a lot about heaven and the place of heaven and how it's described in Scripture, and so I'm curious. You go into it not being a spatial place where we can, if we explore long enough in our universe, we'll be able to find it, right? In regards to what we anticipate heaven to be like based off of Scripture, what is an environment that you felt was the closest to heaven for you that you've experienced in your lifetime?
So for me, I imagine heaven primarily as the place where we're actually in the presence of God. And
Mm-hmm.
so with that in mind, I feel closest to God when I'm out in nature, when I'm hiking a mountain or kayaking on, a river or a lake. That's where I feel oftentimes that I'm most in the presence of God. And as
Yeah.
much as I love that, it makes me look even more forward to what the new heaven and the new earth are going to be like.
Yeah.
If this earth is this glorious, what's that going to look like?
No, absolutely. No, I was thinking, for me, of like yes, presence of God, but also like everyone praising and worshiping Him. And so, um, I think of like Passion when it's in the bigger stadiums, like the 50,000 plus. And for me, like the volume of people just there for
Sure.
worshiping God, but then also like quality of singing wise. When we were at Karen Alexander's mother's funeral
Mm-hmm.
service, and like she was very involved in choir and everything, and like literally everyone except for me in the room, it felt like was an amazing singer. But like it just kind of like made me feel like if this is just, I don't know, maybe 150, 200 people that can sing, and they're, just all just giving it their everything. Can't even imagine like bigger than the volume of Passion, but I hope no one's singing off pitch in heaven. The
Right.
quality that was at the funeral, and just how glorious it would be to just be a part of that choir and just continue praising him. But speaking of Karen Alexander, she brought up a few good questions. She noticed that in the verse that was referenced. Oh, wait, which verse did you speak from again? It was.
Act 7, where Stephen is being stoned, and I think it's verses 55 and 56 where I quoted from Acts 7, where he said he looked and he saw Jesus standing at the right hand of God, or
Yeah,
he saw the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God.
at least it feels like the one time that Jesus is standing versus sitting at the right hand of the Father. And so very interesting, but also do you think there's any specific significance or reason why this would be slightly different?
I don't know.
That's okay.
uh, that's something. It's a good question, and I do wonder what's going on there now that she's raised that question. Why, if everything talks about Jesus being ascended and seated at the right hand of God,
Yeah.
why is he standing there? So that's something I'm going to have to do some research on, read up on, and see what some other commentaries say, and
Yeah.
that
And
might be
that's
one we have to come back to.
and that's when Stephen's being martyred, right?
Yeah.
I mean, this is just the first thing that comes to mind, and nothing to back it up. It's just a beautiful image for me of Jesus standing to like welcome Stephen in
Yeah, like receiving him.
versus, yeah, versus like his place is seated at the right hand of the throne, but to stand up to like when you welcome a guest, you're like sitting in your office or something, and someone comes in, you stand to greet them.
Yeah,
I don't know. That's just
I think
beautiful
that might be a
idea.
great,
Yeah.
great picture of it. Yeah.
She also mentioned that in the First Corinthians verses that you used on the resurrected bodies, that she never really thought much about that before, besides that we'll all have a glorified body. So, is the metaphor that we are the seed when we die? If that's the metaphor, then when we come out of the ground, we will be a new offspring of the like parent plant, per se, if you want to use that phrase, meaning that like God is the parent plant.
Sure. I mean, I think that's kind of how the analogy works, right? Because a seed has to come from a plant initially, right? Like you don't have a seed without a parent plant that propagates that seed, and then but then once that seed is buried and gets all the light and sun, blah blah blah, then it does grow up into that same kind of plant that
Mm,
it came from.
yeah.
I
Mm,
forget who said it or where I even first heard this idea, but it's kind of like the idea that not a miracle that God put seeds in an apple, but
mhm,
the miracle is actually the apple trees in the seed.
mm. We've been going through this Graves into Garden series with our youth, and just last night, Oscar Damager was teaching on the parable of the mustard seed. Talking about
Yeah,
how it's so small, like a grain of salt, but then they grow like over 6 feet tall sometimes. Amazing things that God is able to do, and we may think it's too small, but to trust it to God and allow Him to help it grow. So we're talking about, He's ascended, and He'll come again one day, and kind of throughout church history, people have tried to say it's going to happen now, happen later, but Jesus, says you don't need to know that, right?
right.
Um, and so I'm curious, why do you think knowing when Jesus will return would be bad for the disciples back then or for us now? How could that be a bad thing for us to know?
I don't know about you, but I tend to be somewhat deadline motivated. You
Mm-hmm.
know, if I know when something's due, I know how much time I have until I have to actually start working on it, until it actually matters. And I wonder if that's not the thought. Jesus wanted us to live as if he could come any moment. So that way we would have an urgency about us and the way that we live our lives. And I don't know that we do a great job of that because, it's been now almost 2,000 years since he ascended. And so there's a sense in which it's like, well, it hasn't happened yet. Who knows when it's going to happen? But I think we're supposed to live with more urgency and to live as if each day could be the last one before he comes again. We're not supposed to put it off until that final cram session before the test. We're supposed to live as if any moment he could come again, and I think that's why he didn't want us to know.
Yeah, and that's the thing, like you said, with having like a due date. If you told, hypothetically, I'm not saying it's happening at the end of this year, but like hypothetically, if he told the disciples, like, yeah, you got another 1980 years until I come back or whatever it is, then I'd be like, oh, that's tons of time.
Yeah,
Like, this isn't all our job, our lifetime. Like, we'll let people, future generations, like, take up the mantle. And there's like more of this ease rather than an urgency. But also, I feel like if he were to tell us August 2023, this is when it's happening, and someone receives a word, or he buys every billboard in the country, whatever it is, to get that
right.
message out, and the panic that would
Yeah,
set in, and I don't know how much of a fruitful panic it would be.
sure.
Like, I'm sure some people might hyper focus inward and be like, "Let me get all of my ducks in a row to make sure that I'm good by August 2023." Um, and other people might, due to the pressure, I don't know. I feel like there might be more of a scary urgency to it that they might. give off while they're trying to evangelize,
Yeah. Were
that might scare people even farther away.
yeah. Were you born when Y2K hit? Do you remember that? Seriously?
I was 6,
You do not.
and
Okay. Never
no,
mind
no,
then.
no. I remember the news stories and stuff, and
Yeah.
because my family was not worried, I didn't feel the panic or urgency, but,
Sure.
like, hearing back on it, I was like, "Oh, yeah, I remember everyone talking about the computers not working and the internet dying and the, blah, 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 EMPs, all that weird stuff."
So anyway, it
Yeah.
just made me think like the amount of hysteria that hit prior to that, and it ended up being nothing. But if you knew, no, the world is actually ending and Jesus is coming back to judge the living and the dead,
Yeah.
that might throw the world into a bit of a tailspin.
Oh, yeah, I mean, well, you think of, like, what happened at the beginning of COVID. I mean, if
Sure.
some people feel like they're far too gone and they're like, "Oh, that God's real? Oh, yeah, I got no shot by August. I'm gonna get the toilet paper, I'm gonna get the water bottles, I'm gonna get
Yeah.
the Lysol," like, whatever they think is needed to survive, and so it's just I feel like there would just be more of an intermingling of chaos with,
Mhm.
sooner date, but then also a ease and lax if it's a much farther date. And so I think trying to have that healthy urgency of like, if it's any day, am I satisfied with what I've done for him
Yeah.
today? And so, how can, as a congregation or people that listen that aren't of our congregation, because we just added South Africa and Ghana to our listeners, apparently,
Mm.
um, how can we be praying for you specifically, Pastor Scott?
For me,
Yeah.
well, I mean, always I ask people to pray that I would lead in such a way that our church is becoming who we're supposed to be
Mm,
becoming. And I think part of that means living with a sense of that urgency. I don't know how much of our church's day to day, week to week life, or the people within our church, is actually kind of thinking about the fact that any one of us could be gone any given day. You know, it
mhm.
all it takes is a diagnosis, a car that jumps the curb. It could be
Yeah.
anything, or our neighbor. It could be our neighbor. And does that neighbor know Jesus like
Mhm.
I know Jesus? And am I doing all that I can with the time that's been given to me to reach the world for Jesus? I want to be better at that, so I ask people to pray that for me. But I want to lead our people better in that too.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that would be a big one. And then I think the other thing I would say is, we're actually doing this podcast over Zoom today instead of being in person in the office, because I'm down in Wildwood at our Greater New Jersey annual conference of the United Methodist Church. And I would just want people to pray. By the time this podcast airs, that's going to be over. But I would just ask people to be praying for our denomination, for our church, in the midst of all that's going on in the midst of our denomination. And as we try to discern how to best live into our calling, to how we can be faithful to what God has called us to do and who He's called us to be as a congregation, and just what that looks like as we move into the future.
Yeah. And I think, praying for, even though this will be post conference, praying for all of the people that have gathered there because they're then being sent out and they have a large influence in churches all over our state,
Yeah.
and a little bit in Pennsylvania. Do we have in any other states or just those two?
There are a few in New York too.
Okay. Yeah, and so, just that God would continue to lead them to him, that they would continuously be transformed by the Spirit, and that they'd be able to steer their congregations and the people entrusted to them to him as well.
Well, that's our conversation for today. But that doesn't mean the conversation is over. We'd love to hear your thoughts on these topics as well. To ask a question about anything we've discussed in this episode or to join the conversation, you can head over to fumccollingswood.org/podcast. Thanks for being part of this conversation.